Dude, you can stay in here if you want to.
No,
I don't give a
it's fine.
shit.
I feel that people can focus more when they're not disturbed. Or
I'm
Just
disturbed,
saying.
dude. Like, I'm disturbed.
you know what I mean?
Hey, I recently got back from Timberlawn, where I spent 21 days in the trauma unit. I wanted to share a little bit about my experience and my formal diagnosis. I know I talked about possibly having dissociative identity disorder in my other videos, and now it's official. D.I.D. right there. This video is going to focus on the diagnosis and a few of my authors. I'll go more in depth in a video or two about Timberlawn itself. So let's get started. To understand the diagnosis, I need to briefly set the stage. When I arrived at Timberlawn, it took me about 7 hours to get through initial admissions. By around 3 o'clock, I finally laid my head down to sleep in the trauma unit overflow called Lewis 2. The next morning, I met with several different patients, and we talked about why we were there and discussed our previous diagnoses, just general mental ward chit-chat. The first day I stayed down in the overflow while the other patients took the elevator up to the actual trauma unit. I elected to stay because I only had gotten a few hours of sleep the previous night, and having someone shine a flashlight in your eyes every 15 minutes while you're trying to sleep kind of causes hell. The next day I actually went up to the trauma unit, and honestly I was kind of surprised. It wasn't like any other mental hospital I'd been to before. It was actually quite nice. Wood floors, comfy sofas, skylights, windows with views, and actually an indoor smoking room. When I saw my therapist for the first time, I don't remember much of it actually. I don't know anything about the day before, nor after that. It was kind of like being in a blackout drunk that lasted for 18 hours. But what I do remember is that we began the initial assessment, and around the time that she started asking questions about trauma, a author popped out, and this author is Trevor, who is a 9-year-old boy. Trevor was created through a combination of emotional and physical abuse, along with terrible circumstantial tragedies and homicidal intentions by a perpetrator. He is usually very ashamed and scared. This author of mine is pretty much the reason why I have to take beta blockers, because they control my facial blushing when he's scared and when he's ashamed, essentially. Whenever talking about something that doesn't remotely cause my anxiety, he still may feel ashamed and start blushing. I ended the initial assessment pretty early. The next days were kind of fuzzy because by then I was just dissociating the entire time. I don't know what was real, and that included myself. The internal chatter started up in high gear, and it was pretty much hard to focus on anything. For the most part, another author, Robert, got me through those days, and it's probably the reason why I don't remember much of it. Before I went in the hospital, I knew of Robert. I felt his presence, and he's the one who pretty much talks the most. He was created in 2006 when I survived a tornado that barreled down the street in Waco, Texas. I happened to be in the hospital that night due to a massive migraine headache. While waiting in the hospital ER, I remember the tornado indicators flashing on the local TV news, and the winds began blowing, and hail the size of peaches basically began to fall and smash windows, and we were soon rushed into a large storage closet within the ER. And I remember looking at a dozen or so people's eyes. They were tears from men, tears from women, and fear gripped them, and they huddled on the floor, but not me. I basically just remained standing, disassociating, when this tornado came down the road and shook the building. At that moment, I began to think about my life, who I wanted to be, what I wanted to be, and basically what my life's philosophies were and why. When the power switched off for a moment, there was blackness. Then the glow of the emergency lights clicked on, and basically that moment, he was created. He became everything I wanted to be, where I was not. Robert is a protector alter. He protects the entire system, but don't let that fool you. He's also out for his own interests. If there's any person real or like fiction that he could possibly be, it would most likely be Tyler Durden from Fight Club. Honestly, the parallels between him and Tyler are pretty uncanny. If they both had an OK Cupid profile, it would probably be about a 95% match, and he's the person who bubbles up when my anxiety is really, really high. About a week before I was discharged, my therapist and I ran across 2 different alters while writing a letter to one of my perpetrators. Due to that, that's where April was born, my first alter. April is a 6-year-old girl who is scared, sad, and isolated, and really doesn't like to talk very much. Due to the nature of the abuse, I dissociated myself into trees, grass, and the sky. And she's very fond of being around nature in all of its forms. The further into the woods, pretty much the better. Closer we are to the trees that we could climb, the safer it is. She can be found staring out windows, watching the trees move in the gentle winds, and noticing like the squirrels rummaging for food. And this is pretty much what she had to say to my therapist. The drive home from your house was just as bad as being there. A piece of you always left with me. I would stare out the window of the car, watching the trees as they went by. And I remember the look of them. They weren't real. I wasn't real. Nothing was real. One time we got to your house and I hid from you in the backyard. I thought you wouldn't see me from behind the bushes. I was sitting there looking at the grass, then it wasn't anymore. I was floating. And I remember before my 10th birthday, around the time that Trevor was born, I was laying in my bedroom, beating my head against the wall, over and over and over again. And while doing that, I was saying the same phrase every single time my head connected, and that was, I want to go home, I want to go home, I want to go home. And this is a phrase that is uttered by April when the abuse happened. And it's kind of funny how pieces come together. During the same session that April came out, another alter named Chase showed up, and Chase is a protector alter of April. Chase's function, therefore, is to protect the system, but primarily is there to protect the alter April. Little is known about him except he is very angry and doesn't shy away from a fight. In fact, he kind of looks forward to it. He was created when retribution was finally dealt to the sexual abuser. And that was the moment, basically, where I split. And I didn't exist anymore. I caught him off guard. The first few punches to his face didn't do as much damage as I was hoping for, so I kept at it, until a broken tooth tore my hand open. By now I started to become slightly satisfied, but it wasn't done. Fearing the immediate retribution if he stood, it would have been over, so let's fix that. My foot found home in his crotch, and I remember the terrified look in his eyes. Perhaps he would die. But I wasn't done. Before the blood dripped down his chin, and while still in shock from becoming a eunuch, I grabbed his arm and drove home the hardest kicks I could possibly deliver to his chest. Then a few kicks to his stomach, and one last kick to the front of his chest, which left a crunch. Watching him unable to breathe was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Having his balls kicked in, having the wind knocked out, with a broken rib, and every time he inhaled life, he choked on the blood that filled his mouth. The gasp of the gurgling sounds were music to my ear. I was punished quite heavily after that, but then there was kind of a sick and disturbing grin on my face. And Chase has been around for every fight I've had. It usually doesn't bode well for the other recipient. Even if they land a punch, I don't feel it. He's able to turn the pain off entirely, like someone on meth. The last week I was there, my dissociation became less severe, and I learned more about me and I learned more about my disorder. The last day came quickly, and it was kind of a rather sad event because I got to know a lot of really good people. You know, when you spend a month together with a group of people, you develop a really close bond. You know, there were hugs and there were tears, and they were shed very easily. Then the doors opened to a whole new world for me, filled with self-awareness and endless possibilities. Going to Timberlawn was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. One of the hardest things I've ever experienced. But it was also the most rewarding.